My name is Vishwas. I head the IT software division at Artistry Global Outsourcing. I welcome you all to the Data Artistry Tournament 2018, a one-of-a-kind tournament that we are very proud to host at Artistry, and this is being made possible by a partnership with Gramener and NASCOM. Data, as we know, has three main characteristics: volume, velocity, and variety. Traditionally, businesses have been focused on trying to enhance and amass the amount of data that they could collect on their customers and based on their customers' demands. Now, as the volumes increased, the need for variety and velocity also increased. Now, why am I talking about these three characteristics? Because it presents us a unique challenge where we now have to have a proper combination of volume, velocity, and variety in order to make sense for the customers. Now, let me take a step back and try to put this in the context. As they say, context is king. From a customer standpoint, they can always provide us n number of data sources, n number of variety of data sources, and obviously the amount of volume of data, which is just quadrupling by every day. Historically, IT organizations have been more focused on trying to manage the volume of data. Over the last few decades, I think we have done a fair job trying to manage that volume of data as it grew along with the industry. Now, then comes the challenge of variety and velocity. With variety brings the challenge where we now have to worry about the different data sources. With variety comes the challenge of managing the velocity, because as the data grows in the industries like IoT and all the other areas where the velocity and variety have a deep meaning to worry about, we have been more focused on trying to sense how we can make sense out of this data. If I have to put this challenge of volume, velocity, and variety into context, think of it like you're on a highway without any mile markers or any display signages. So essentially what it means is you're headed in a direction where you don't know. Obviously, you're going to get lost. Now, if I have to look at the big picture, imagine the same journey being taken up aerial-wise. Now you see where you're really headed into. From that perspective, if I have to make sense for my customers' data, I have to start looking at the connections that each of these data sets make. There is always a story to be told. And we as humans always relate to stories, because that's what we can intrinsically relate ourselves to, and our sense of understanding from a frame of reference of this world is always related upon. In the world of data insights, if I have to talk, why is it important? Data insights enables us to look through those perspectives of the customers and their customers' data in order to make a real sense out of it. For example, if you are looking at a volume of data which is maybe about an elections data, it makes more sense to look at not just the amount of voting that has happened from that constituency. It is now to look at how has been the demographics which is supporting the local leader over there. Now we need to look at how many people came for the voting, how many people actually turned up at what time, and what was the velocity and the variety in terms of the demographic of the people who came for the voting. If I have to extrapolate the same problem statement in the world of IoT, there's going to be a mass of data which is beyond anyone's control, because this is going to be live. And managing that data set in order to make sense out of that is a challenge by itself. Traditionally, if I have to look at it, would a simple Excel spreadsheet or a web-based application, would it cut? Probably yes and no, but can it actually deliver the right value, the right insights for the customer? That's where the data artistry comes into play. Data artists is not something new. It's been in the existence for many centuries. It's the enablement of these technologies which enables us to make sense of the real data is what we are talking about. Data artistry in itself enables the different technology and the creative part of it all come together. What I mean by that, we have data scientists who can actually make sense out of the data in terms of what is it trying to tell, and the data artists who are creative guys who are going to more look at it from a how can I enable the storytelling for this data set. You're going to have technology guys who are coming in terms of understanding how can I desensitize the data, how can I actually provide more insights by providing the data transformations. So all of these areas are going to help us to understand the real story behind it. As I said, any data which is not in the form of information is not going to be useful for our customers. So the pursuit of making sense out of data via the journey of making the data as information is the whole and sole purpose of what the data artistry is all about. With that being said, let me take the opportunity to welcome Anand, who is the CEO and the Chief Data Scientist at Gramener. So, Anand is going to walk us through an exciting journey in terms of what data visualization and data artistry can do to the typical data sets, which are by default probably boring, and how he and his team have actually worked on several examples in the past, and also essentially ensuring that how the data insights can be brought out of a simple, large, or medium to complex data sets.
So Vishwas told you why data stories are important. What I'm going to tell you is how you create these data stories. As I've seen it, there are 4 ways of telling a data story. You start by just exposing the data, and that in itself is pretty useful sometimes. But you can go beyond and start telling stories as charts, for example, showing people the data. That is, explaining to them what's happening behind the scenes, not just as numbers, but better yet as pictures, because we understand pictures better. But even that often is not enough. We usually want to provide an explanation for it. An explanation helps because people then understand the story behind it. They understand the context, they understand what they need to do, and that's the next level of exploration. But the thing is, we don't necessarily want to stop here, because what this assumes is that the storyteller knows more than the audience. Sometimes, with the power of data, the audience can discover things for themselves that the storyteller does not know, and that's where the power of exploration comes in. And these are the 4 broad ways I've seen data stories being told. Somebody just dumps the data and says, take it and do what you want with it. Or somebody says, here are a bunch of charts, make what you can of it. Or somebody says, here's an explanation, this is what I've inferred from the data and I'm helping you understand. Or people say, I'll provide you with an interface that will help you understand what you can out of the story. And you then make your own data stories. Each of these has a certain value. For example, if you take the effort of the creator, it's very easy for us to just expose the data. Well, I wouldn't say very easy, relatively easy to just expose the data and to show the data as charts. That's not too difficult. But then if you want to put together an explanation, you need to know the domain in the first place. If you want to put together an exploratory interface, then you are crafting a full-fledged application. Both of those are hard. For the audience, for the consumer, on the other hand, showing what's happening makes it easy for them to understand as opposed to just looking at the data. An explanation is where somebody has already thought through what needs to be told and people are just absorbing it. It's like reading a book or a novel, in fact, a picture story. On the other hand, if I'm just given a dump of the data, that's not very easy for me to infer or make sense out of. If I'm given an interface to explore, then I have to take the effort to create a data story on my own. So that's not relatively easy. Having said that, every single one of these has its place. And what I'll be doing is showing you examples of how these data stories can be created using each of these 4 formats. Why is this important? For this particular hackathon, you will typically be picking one of these formats, and every single one of these has its own advantages and disadvantages. What I'd like to talk about is how you use this format to tell a story and make sure that you get to the objective that you want to, and make it clear up front that I'm going to create an exploratory interface, for instance. I'm not trying to tell a story. I just want the audience to be able to understand what's happening. Or I am going to tell a story, but I'm going to tell a story not by way of an explanation, but by helping people understand what's happening quickly and putting it through pictures. So once you have your objective reasonably clear, you will want to look at firstly the data itself. Now, before I go into these formats, I'll just tell you a little bit about just exposing the data or what it takes to put the data out. Now, even though I've called these 4 formats, in reality, from a data story perspective, there are only 3, and exposing is not part of it because, that's just getting the data out, right? But let's not forget how much effort goes on behind the scenes in putting the data out. For example, if you take the Election Commission data, which is available actually in the form of PDFs on the Election Commission website. And when I say PDFs, I mean it's lots and lots and lots of PDFs, right? There are several thousands of pages of data sitting in this format, from which the first big task is just getting it into a textual form, getting it into a form where each of these can be converted into something that is parsable by a machine. And even then, there are several issues with this. To begin with, they are not necessarily aligned. You will see a bunch of gaps here. You will see some names are split into the second row. For example, I discovered after looking at this data that the state that has the longest candidate names is Gujarat. So there would be a huge name, somebody by, somebody by, somebody by, son of somebody by, and there's also an alias for them, which effectively takes the name to 3 rows. I thought it would have been Andhra Pradesh, but it apparently isn't. Now, this kind of formatting is not very easy, and you have to do the parsing to make sure that you convert it from this kind of a textual format into something that can be loaded in Excel. And that's a piece of work in itself. And you think that at this point you've got the data, right? No, this is where the work really begins. Because then you have, for example, when you look at how many candidates stood for election in each constituency, you will find that there is a constituency, Alan, in which there were 5 people standing for election in 1957, 3 people standing for election in 1962, and so on. And then suddenly in 1972 onwards, they stopped standing for elections, and suddenly there's another constituency which spelled slightly differently, but is evidently the same constituency where people have been standing for elections. And then suddenly they stop here and then start back at the old Alat. In other words, the constituency name has been spelled differently in different periods. The same is true for Arabhavi and Arbhavi, where you can see this kind of a tilt, or Athni and Athni. So, which means that we also have to take care of corrections in the data. Now, these kinds of corrections take various forms. So, it could be phonetic. It need not be alphabetically similar like I showed. And that was easy to spot because we were just sorting it alphabetically. So, you can see that one constituency is very similar to another. But Kundapur and Kundapura, which are obviously phonetically identical and could be the same constituency, are not necessarily trappable alphabetically. In fact, the toughest problem that we had was with Bandar and Machilipatnam, which we realized later on was actually the same constituency. But I mean, how do you even figure that out unless you have some knowledge of the domain, right? And it's not just constituency names that are misspelled. We have, for example, party names that are misspelled. These are all the same party, but just spelled in different ways. You have party names that actually change. The ADMK is the AIADMK, is the ADK, just that this was a party name at different times, even officially. And the parties can restructure. The INC Indra is not really INC, but for all practical purposes, that is what we need to treat it to be. So, putting together all of these elements requires us to get the infrastructure to be able to expose the data, and that's what comes first. But the good part is, as far as this hackathon is concerned, that's been done for you. You have the data. You just need to figure out how to show, explain, or explore the data. What do I mean by show the data? And you would ask the question, look, if I have the numbers, I have the data, then what is the point of just showing it? What value does mere visual representation add? Well, one of the first visualizations that we created a long time ago was a video of India's weather. We took every single district's temperature from 1900 all the way to 2000, every single month. This is a fairly detailed and large data set, and plotted it on a map and said, let's run it as a video. What you find is that some portions of the country are relatively cool through the year. The pieces that are green are cold, the pieces that are red are hot, yellow somewhere in between. And you can see that Jammu and Kashmir is relatively cool through the year, which you obviously knew. You also find that the west coast of India is consistently cool through the year, which was to me a bit of a surprise. I actually managed to find my retirement spot based on this piece of analysis. But the oddest thing that we found was, even though the country is going through waves of summer and winter, there are some spots that are flashing. You see this one spot here, which is hot when the surrounding areas are cool, and cool when the surrounding areas are hot, effectively exhibiting a counter-cyclic weather pattern. This is Bilaspur in Chhattisgarh. We don't know why. And it's an ongoing research problem to figure out why Bilaspur is hot when the surrounding areas are cold and cold when the surrounding areas are hot. But the odd thing about it is that the first time that this was spotted was when the meteorological department saw this video. They said maybe there's something wrong with the data. They went back, they investigated, they came back and said, no, there's something wrong with the data. You have discovered something on data that we have had for literally a century and are now seeing it for the first time. Sometimes you just need to see stuff to be able to figure out what's happening. Another case where the power of showing things was showcased was when we were looking at the election data that I talked about a short while ago. We were looking at how many people contest in each constituency. This represents the number of people that are standing for elections in the 1967 Tamil Nadu Assembly elections. What we find is that the circles are larger where there are more candidates and smaller where there are fewer candidates, plotted on a rough map of Tamil Nadu. So in 1967, it's a reasonable mix. In 1971, there are a few new constituencies that get added. In 1977, there's a spurt. there's an increase in the sizes of the circles, indicating that there are more candidates that are contesting in these elections. And the color of the circle represents which party won. You'll notice that earlier it was largely yellow, and that was DMK that was winning all the elections. Now a new party has come in, the ADMK, and that has swept the state. And we have a color change, and this has also led to an increased level of participation across. So as we were browsing through, we were looking for whether there were any anomalies. Let's take another example. This is actually from the same election data that I showed you a short while ago. The question that we were looking at was, where do people stand for elections? How many people contest in each constituency? And when we were looking at this data, what we found was pretty interesting. In the assembly elections in Tamil Nadu in 1967, this is a map that shows the number of candidates that stood for election in each constituency. The size of the circle represents the number of candidates. So, for example, in Perambalur, there were 10 candidates that stood for election, and that is therefore a slightly larger circle than the neighboring Varahur, where there were only 5 candidates that stood for election. The color represents which party won. Now, this was in 1967. If you look at 1971, things haven't changed that much. There are a few new constituencies that have come in. There are a few changes in the people that won in each constituency. But the real change came in 1977 when there's a sudden spurt in the overall level of participation. We have more people standing for election in each constituency. And we also have a huge color change. And that's because ADMK has come in as a new party and has swept the elections. But let's get back to our original task. Where do people stand for elections the most? 1980, not that much of a change. But 1984, we have Maduranthakam, where as many as 90 people are standing for elections in the same constituency. Now, you can see that most of these are independent candidates. Understandably, you can't have 90 parties. So, it's obviously going to be 90 or close to 90 independents that are standing for election. 1989, an overall spurt, but nothing stands out. 1991, we have 2 constituencies that stand out. But I'm not going to pause about this. I'm going to talk instead about the 1996 elections, where in Maduranthakam, there were as many as 1,000 candidates, over 1,000 candidates standing for election in just one constituency. Now think about that. 1,000 people in just one constituency. And this visual made it entirely apparent to the entire country when we showed it on national television that there's something really odd going on. And this is again data that has existed for many decades, that people, when they look at it this way, finds a huge anomaly. And what's even more anomalous is the nature of what happened here in the first place. Firstly, if you look at the names of the candidates that stood for election, this is what it looks like. There's a Palanisamy K, Palanisamy K, Palanisamy K, Palanisamy K, Palanisamy K. I mean, if you are a Palanisamy K, then how do you figure out which Palanisamy K you are to vote for yourself, right? There's certainly no picture of you. There's certainly no party symbol. So this is going to be a bit tricky, which proved to be a problem, I suspect, because there were as many as 88 candidates who got exactly 0 votes. Meaning, they stood for election and didn't even vote for themselves. That's the only way you can get 0 votes, right? So what's happening here? Now, these are cases where we take simple numbers and just put it together into a chart, and people are able to spot things that were not otherwise spottable. That is the power of showing stuff. But beyond this, we need to get to explanations. Explain why things are happening. And the reason is you need to provide the context around it. You need to understand why this is important. Now, it's one thing to say that in Maduranthakam, there were 1,033 candidates that stood for election. It's entirely another thing to tell you the story behind why it happened, which is that there was a farmers' protest and that there were people who said, I'm going to just sit outside the election commission office and give people 500 rupees to just stand for election. That is the story behind it. And how does one communicate these stories? Mostly infographics are the commonly used techniques today, but there are several more formats. And a good place to start looking at these formats is just to go through the New York Times website. As a leader in data journalism, they're doing some fantastic work in terms of telling data stories, and you'll find several examples of data stories out there that are very innovative in terms of formats. But I'm going to talk about just a few simple formats that I believe you will be able to create during the course of this hackathon. Here, for example, is an infographic that talks about working hours. The data set here was how many people have been working for how many hours across the years. And there are several patterns of insights that emerge. For example, we find that as the productivity increases, the number of working hours has decreased. So, for example, Norway is a country which has one of the highest levels of productivity, and they also have among the lowest levels of working hours. On the other hand, Cambodia is the exact opposite, very low productivity and the highest level of working hours. And this is fairly well correlated. What you will notice about what I said was I'm not doing much more than reading off of the content. in the earlier visualizations where I was showing stuff, I was giving you a lot more context. Here, I'm not doing anything more than reading it off this chart, off this infographic. Now, why is this important? Sometimes your means of communication is not through an interaction. Your only means of communication is through printed material. Your objective is to drive an action. You want to tell people what to do. You want to tell people how they should do it. In that case, you don't want them to spend any time and energy trying to figure out what your message is. That should be abundantly clear. The only thing that you want to drive is the action that they should be taking. Who uses things like this? Anyone who's in the business of convincing people of a certain activity. So, for example, the entire NGO space finds this very effective. In fact, even in corporate presentations, we find it very effective to tell people this is what's happening. And the whole realm of slideware is largely about telling people what needs to be done. But the output, even though we are talking about infographics, does not necessarily need to be static. Even with the tool set that we have, it's possible to create something that is much more powerful. For example, I'm going to pause here. I didn't have this open, but I'm going to open it. And persistent party. Yeah, here we go. Yeah. For example, one can create a web-based animated interactive. This, for example, is a story in which we talk about what's happening, but also with a simple overlay of animated graphics on top of it, created as a web application. Now, what is the story that it's telling? I'm largely going to read out from here, except not word by word, but just tell you what happened. We were looking for which is the party that had the worst success rate. We knew that Congress was the party that had the highest success rate. But is there such a thing as the worst party that had the maximum defeats? Obviously, party that never won counts. But is there some party that has just never ever won despite standing for elections in a huge number of constituencies? Turns out that there is one called the Doordarshi party, which has contested in over 700 elections and never won a single seat. And this is across 3 different elections. The first time they stood in about 90 odd constituencies. Let's get to that number. In 1984, they stood for elections in 97 constituencies, mostly in the UP region and the Gujarat region. 0 wins. In 1989, they expanded, becoming a party that contested in 298 out of the 500 odd constituencies, making them incidentally the second largest party after Congress in terms of the number of seats that they contested in, out of which they won exactly 0. Or in 1991, they contested in 321 constituencies. They never gave up. And out of the 321, they won exactly 0 seats. Now, what is even more interesting is that not only did they not win in even a single constituency, they were never even the runner-up ever. At best, they were number 3, and that was usually in constituencies where there were only 3 candidates. So we are here telling a story in a format that is web-based. The format could also be a PowerPoint interactive story. The format could be a print story. The format could be a mobile application. The format could be even a physical design that can tell a story. In this hackathon, we are not restricting you in any way with the format, except we probably don't want you to create sculptures, but leaving that aside, pretty much any format is okay. And if you want to create an explanation, just keep one thing in mind. I, as a reader, should not have to think. You should just tell me what I need to take away, and it should be interesting and it should be engaging. That's our second format. The other format that you can explore is one of exploratory visualizations. Now, here you don't have an agenda. You're not communicating what needs to be told. What you're saying is, I will allow you to interact with the data set in ways that I believe will be helpful. So I will shape your exploration, but I will leave the final conclusion to you. You are the master. You are the one that's directing the story, and you will finally come out with an outcome that nobody knows, but I will provide you with an interface to do this. How does this work? Let me give you an example of how this has been done using just PowerPoint. I'm going to stay here. One of our clients said they wanted to understand how many people are downloading apps from their app store and where these people are coming from. And could this be done as an interactive PowerPoint visualization? So this is a presentation but not a presentation intended at communicating a fixed message. It's a presentation intended at allowing people to explore. It shows the number of people that downloaded the apps from the App Store on a daily basis. And it also shows the breakup by country. So most of the downloads came from the US, followed by China, Germany, UK, etc. Most of the models were Android 4 at that time, followed by iOS 4, and so on. The color indicates the rate of growth. So Android 4 was not growing as fast as iOS 4, and therefore it's more yellowish or reddish or orangish than iOS 4, which is much greener. Now I can ask the question, why is it that Android 4 did not grow so much? Click. And that shows me the breakup of the volume of downloads of Android 4. The bulk of the downloads came from games, but that is clearly not growing. In fact, it's shrinking by about 2.5%. Nor did the education sector grow, nor did the tool sector grow. It's only the music and video segment in Android 4 that is pulling it up a little bit. So now I have an understanding of why the Android 4 segment did not grow. I can also ask, why is it that games are not growing as fast? Because the newbie segment, which is the one that is downloading the most games, are not downloading enough games right now, nor are the double income no kid segment. But the retired segment is contributing a little bit to the growth and therefore compensating for these declines. These are not questions that are posed beforehand to which a person constructs an answer. These are questions that come up dynamically that the interface allows you to solve. You typically won't be creating interactive PowerPoint presentations. Those are a little trickier. It's usually easier to allow software to create the interfaces that will allow people to explore. And these kinds of interfaces are pretty common. The data set that we're going to be talking about is the National Achievement Survey data. This, in fact, is one of the data sets that you'll be exploring in the hackathon. And I'll show you what an exploratory interface can reveal. We were looking at how we can present the data in a way that will help us understand why students score higher marks or lower marks. Before that, a quick explanation of what this data set is about. The NCERT conducted a large-scale survey in which they asked the question, what do the students do? What do the parents do? What do the teachers do? And the what has been broken up into hundreds of parameters. How many books do students read? How far do they have to travel? What kinds of television programs do they watch? Do they have private tuition or not? Hundreds of questions like this. Similarly for the teachers and similarly for the schools. Now the question was, is there certain student behavior that drives better performance? They also knew the students' marks based on their performance on a quiz across various subjects. So our task was to try and see if we can create an exploratory interface that allows us to identify whether one particular behavior drives more marks than another. For example, if we take the behavior around reading, do children who read more books score more? So there are children who read no books, 1 to 10 books, 11 to 25, that's a typo, 25 or more books. And the size of the bubble represents the number of children who are reading no books or 1 to 10 books or so on. And the 1 to 10 books is the most common. The bar here represents the average marks that these children score. And you can see that the ones that read 25 or more books clearly score higher. And that is more than those that read fewer books and no books at all. And the difference between the worst and the best, that is those that read no books and those that read 25 or more books, is about 8 marks out of 100. So I know two things. A, that reading books does help, and it helps by about 8 percentage points. Now I could ask the same question of television watching. Does television watching make a difference? It turns out that television watching has only a 3 percentage point impact. So which means that rather than stopping kids from watching TV, you're just better off channeling them into reading more books. Does playing games make a difference? Yes, playing games does make a difference as well. And that is also only about 3%. So the reading behavior has the maximum effect. And the way we did this was through an interface that allows people to explore. So this shows us the impact of various parameters. So what is the impact of watching television? It turns out that there's an impact of watching television in mathematics of 1.5%, in reading of 5.3%, in science of 2%, in social science of 1.1%. So you can see that the impact varies from subject to subject as well. What's also interesting is that when it comes to, let's say, science, the more you watch, the less you score, but it tapers off after a point. Once a week seems to be a sweet spot. So if you're watching TV about once a week, that's good. You watch TV every day, not so good, at least in science. The same is true for social science. Once a week seems to be about a sweet spot. If I look at reading behavior though, the more I watch TV, the better my reading behavior becomes. Let's take, on the other hand, mathematics. Now, this is a disaster. If I watch TV every day, then my marks are worse than children who never ever watch TV. And remember that the children who never ever watch TV are probably the ones that don't have TV at home, which means that a well educated and affluent child is probably scoring lower than a child who would normally have had lower marks because of sheer level of affluence or degree of exposure. That's how bad TV watching is for mathematics. But on the other hand, if I take a behavior like playing games, turns out that the more I play, the better it is for my mathematics scores. But on the other hand, if I look at reading behavior, it turns out that the more I play, the less I score. Unless, of course, I'm not playing at all, which is not a good idea. But as long as I go out and play just at least once a month, I'm good. Now, these are explanations that come out of an exploratory interface where we can dig deeper and see what's happening. We dug deeper into this interface and found that, for example, the factor that matters the most across all of these parameters, if I sort by what factor influences the total, there are 4 factors that matter: father's education, father's occupation; mother's education, mother's occupation. Almost everything else is significantly secondary. And it's also interesting that the father's education, father's occupation are slightly higher in importance than the mother's education and mother's occupation. Now, this is true for the country in general, but is it true for every state? For example, if I take a matriarchal state like West Bengal, it turns out that the father is even more important. The mother is far less important in Madhya Pradesh when it comes to determining the child's marks. What about a patriarchal state like, let's say, Punjab? Here, it turns out that the mother's occupation is more important than the father, which on the one hand may seem counterintuitive, but on the other hand, you could argue that the primary homemaker is the one who has the larger influence on the child's marks. And in a patriarchal society, it is the mother that is more likely to be teaching the child. And which is not to say that in West Bengal, it's the fathers that are teaching the child, but I suspect there's more of that happening in West Bengal than it is in Punjab. This is an exploratory interface where you're diving in, clicking, seeing what's happening. And while I'm giving you a voiceover, what I'm presenting is the information that was gathered by the existence of an exploratory interface. And therefore, you have the option of creating something that is exploratory, that allows people to figure out their own insights, or create something that shows people what's happening, take an in-between ground where you make it easy for them to understand, or you go the whole hog and create an explanatory interface where you tell them what's happening. These are ways of telling data stories, but remember, this is just a format, just a canvas. Your imagination is your playground. Feel free to create absolutely anything that you want. All of this is going to be dependent, however, on the technology behind this. And from a technology perspective, I'm just going to give you a few tips. I'm not going to say use this piece of software or restrict yourself to any one single technology. But if you're looking for guidance on where to start, then broadly, for each of the 3 categories, to show, explain, or explore, we find that BI applications, the likes of Excel, Power BI, Tableau, are the ones that are easiest to create charts out of. If you're not familiar with any one of these, it's pretty easy to learn. You can download all of them for free and start exploring them. You probably already have Excel on your machine, and Power BI and Tableau are fairly quick downloads. Do try them out. This allows you to convert the data into charts. If you want to provide an explanatory interface on top of that, then you're probably better off going into a design interface. PowerPoint is perfectly fine. So is Photoshop. So is Sketch. Any tool that you feel like. Paper and pen is perfectly fine too, for that matter. A lot of really good sketch notes can be extremely powerful when it comes to telling data stories. But don't stop here. Create a video. Some of you may have seen Hans Rosling's video. In fact, I suspect all of you in this hackathon have probably seen it. And if you haven't, please watch it. There's one with the BBC that he's screened, in which he stands in front of what looks like a hologram, but it's not really a hologram, and tells a story visually with the charts appearing in front of him. I'd love to see some of that kind of work coming out of you guys. The point though is, don't be restricted by format, and of the various formats, the explanatory format is the one that gives you the most power and the ability to create artistic sophistry that is beyond what we would normally imagine. However, if you're looking for some starting tools, these would work just fine. On the other hand, if you're looking to create an exploratory interface, then you need programmatic capability. Don't even attempt it unless you're reasonably good in some programming language. What are the most common programming languages that people use? JavaScript, in which case you probably want to go for either D3 or Vega. These are the two most popular libraries for creating data visualizations these days. D3 being the more powerful low level one, Vega being slightly higher level, slightly less powerful, but pretty, and both of them have a very steep learning curve, but both reasonably effective. If you don't already know D3, then I would not suggest you try and learn D3 in the course of this hackathon. You're better off finding somebody who knows D3 and pulling them into your team. Vega is probably learnable. If you want to use Python, that's probably the second most popular language for interactive visualizations. Then Seaborn is a popular library that's built on top of a library called Matplotlib. You could also use Boca. And between these three, Seaborn, Matplotlib, and Boca, these are the most popular libraries that are out there. Again, don't feel restricted. Feel free to use any library of your choice. Between JavaScript and Python, which one would you choose? Short answer, whatever you know better. Don't worry about which one has a better output format. And short answer is JavaScript is more preferred over Python. But if you don't know JavaScript as well as you know Python, go with Python. You're much more likely to create better output with that. And the third language of choice that people use these days is R, on which ggplot2 is the de facto library for creating any kinds of visualizations. And if you want to create it as an interactive library, then Shiny is a pretty good choice for building a web application server and exposing it. In summary, the tool sets are there. I've suggested a few, but you are probably familiar with some of these or others. Go with the tool that is of your choice. That's the most important thing. Finally, the data sets themselves. We will be sharing the details of the three data sets that are part of this hackathon. One is a cricket related data set, one is a voter survey data set, and the third is the National Achievement Survey data set on which I showed you some details before. All of these data sets are accessible through an API. The way the API works is you will be given an endpoint, which is gramener.com/datasets, in which the data is available in the form of a URL that you can construct programmatically. But before I show you the programmatic construction, let me quickly show you what the interface looks like. Let us take the IPL match results. So this is a data set that has the results of all IPL matches from 2008 all the way down to 2016 March or May. And we have the details of which city it was played in, the date on which it was played, the two teams that played, which team won the toss, what decision they made, what the result was, how many runs they won by, and so on. And while this is one part of the data set, the other part of the data set is a ball by ball result. In the first over of the first match, what happened? So, Kolkata Knight Riders was batting and Royal Challengers Bangalore was bowling. In the first ball, Saurav Ganguly was batting to McCullum's ball. With McCullum on the non-striker's end and facing P. Kumar. And there was a single leg by that happened, and therefore the team got one total run as an extra. At that level, there is data for every single IPL match, and this is one of the data sets that you'll be exploring. How do you get insights from this data set? Well, you go to this interface and you can choose to export the entire thing as Excel or CSVs, or if you're looking for a programmatic interface, JSON or HTML. If I ask the question, for KKR, out of all the data sets, how many matches did they win when they chose to field versus when they chose to bat? So now what I find is that of the 62 matches that KKR has played, they've decided to bat in 30 occasions and they've decided to field in 32 occasions. That's not too much of a difference. And it turns out that where KKR decided to bat, Out of the 30 matches, 15 they won, 15 they lost. But where they decided to field, they won only 12 and lost 20. So at least for KKR, it's certainly better to bat where at least they win half of the matches rather than to field where they've lost about significantly more than half of their matches. So this is an example of a simple insight that you get by downloading the data, working on this offline. Now the question is, how do you convert this into a story? Create a chart, show it. That's a possibility. Create an exploratory interface that allows me to figure out the story without having to do what I just did in so much time. That's a possibility. Or spin a series of stories. Find out what happened to RCB, find out what happened to the CSK, find out what happened to each of these teams, whether it's better for them to bat or bowl or field. And then string that into an explanation that says, here are the strengths of the teams, here are the weaknesses of the teams. Any of these are options. The interface that you have to play with is there, which allows you to filter and pick and download any subset of the data. You can also export this as an API into JSON. So for those of you who are into programming, if you want to filter where, for example, the toss decision is fielding and the player of the match is McCullum and any such, you can create a set of URL query parameters as a REST API, and the result will come through as a JSON file, which you can include in your app. This, for those of you who may be concerned, is CORS enabled, which means that you will be able to host on any other server and still be able to pull the data off of this server. We will be sharing the details of how this can be hosted and how you can pull the data in more detail. But remember that the programmatic interface is something that you will need if you're creating exploratory interfaces, and the interface that you have that allows you to filter and download will prove far more useful if you're going to be creating either charts for showing the data or an explanatory interface that helps people understand what's happening. With that, I just want to wish you all the best. Really looking forward to seeing some of your submissions. Have fun. More than anything else, see what you can learn out of this process. And I'd love to hear from you any feedback that you have on the hackathon and how it went. Thank you.
That was one inspiring session by Anand. And I was truly inspired to see what data can do for us. With all this amount of information out there, it's more imperative for us to see and respect what the insights that data can provide for us. And I thank Anand for his time today, this morning, in order to walk us through the session in terms of what Gramener has to offer and what tools and technologies that Gramener has mastered. Now, with that, let's spend some time to understand our rules of the engagement for this tournament is all about. So the tournament in itself is broken into several phases. The first of the phases is what we went through as a session by Anand today. As inspiring as it was, I'm also eager to get my hands on the data set so that I can start doing the visualization just like any one of you. Now, post this session, the registrations are going to be open for each one of you. You can register yourself. Once you register, we are also going to ask you a few questions in terms of what's going to be your technology that with which you're going to do the visualization, what your credentials are going to be. Once after the registrations are complete, you will be gaining access to the data set that Anand talked about, the 3 data sets that we would want you to use your data artistry, your expertise and skills, and provide the visualizations that we are looking for. The registrations post which you will have about 5 to 10 days time for you to come up with visualizations. Once your visualizations are ready, during this course of time, we'll also be assigning you mentors. Now, you can reach out to these mentors should you have some questions or clarifications that you would seek, and we'll be more than happy to provide you those clarifications. Please note that March 5th is the last date for submission. Please ensure you submit your entries before that. Once after the March 5th deadline crosses, by March the 12th, we're going to be announcing the top 10 entries. Now, these top 10 entries on the day of the finale are required to be part of the panel discussions. They'll be given an opportunity to provide the presentations. Now, out of these top 10 presentations and the contestants, we and our judges here are going to select the top 1 entry which qualifies in itself to be as a winner. Now, that decision will be taken on the date of March the 17th. Please ensure that you stick to these deadlines in order for you to submission and be qualified for this tournament and win a chance to win the prize. Thank you.